It was supposed to be a beautiful day. The kind of day that fills the pages of history books and gets talked about for generations. Flowers lined the streets. Flags were raised. School children stood in neat rows holding little paper banners, waving them in the cool morning air with wide, hopeful eyes. Across the United Kingdom, millions of people pressed their faces close to television screens, cups of tea balanced in their hands, waiting for that first glimpse. Waiting for the moment when the world would see Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, together, radiant, smiling, and everything the people had hoped for. But what actually unfolded on that day was something no one could have fully prepared for. What was meant to be a celebration quietly turned into something far more emotional, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than any public ceremony had any right to be. The morning had begun with all the usual precision that the British royal family is known for. The staff at Kensington Palace had been preparing for weeks. Every detail had been arranged, reviewed, and arranged again. The flowers were chosen with care. The timing of each appearance had been rehearsed so that things would flow without a single awkward pause. Security teams had swept through every planned location multiple times. Coordinators had spoken at length about the optics, how it would all look on camera, how it would feel to the public, what message it would send to the world. For the royal family, appearances are never accidental. Every movement, every gesture, every carefully chosen outfit carries meaning. And this occasion was no different. If anything, it carried more weight than most. People across the country had been following William and Catherine's story for years, but the past several months had been different. There was an undercurrent of worry that had settled into the hearts of those who had grown up watching this couple, who had cheered at their wedding, who had celebrated the births of their children, who had admired them from a distance the way ordinary people often admire those they feel they know, but will never actually meet. The worrying had started quietly, the way most worries do, small things noticed here, small things noticed there, and then it had grown into something harder to ignore. Now, with this public appearance, the hope was that everything would feel normal again, that the sight of William and Catherine, side by side, would be enough to chase away the concern and replace it with reassurance. Catherine stepped out first. She wore a coat in a deep, muted blue that matched the kind of autumn sky that sits just on the edge of winter. Her hair was down, styled simply, falling past her shoulders the way it so often did. She smiled at the crowd, that familiar warm smile, the one that made people feel seen even from 50 feet away. There was a small wave, practiced and graceful. The crowd responded immediately with a roar of affection that moved through the gathered people like a wave itself. Children shouted her name. Older women pressed their hands to their hearts. Cameras clicked and flashed from every direction. For a moment, it really did seem like everything was going to be fine. Then William appeared beside her, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone could immediately name or point to. But those who were paying close attention, and there were many, noticed it. His eyes, usually warm and easy in public settings, held something else on this day. Something contained, something carefully managed. He smiled, yes, he waved. He shook hands and leaned in to speak with the people who had come to see them. But beneath all of it, beneath every public-facing gesture, there was the unmistakable heaviness of a man carrying something enormous. A weight that no amount of duty or training could fully hide. The couple moved through the crowd together, standing close, speaking softly to the people gathered along the route. And slowly, as the minutes passed, as the cameras continued to roll and the reporters continued their murmured commentary, those watching began to understand that what they were seeing was not a routine royal appearance. This was something else. This was to people trying, with everything they had, to hold themselves together in public, trying to give the crowd what they had come for, while privately managing a storm that had no easy resolution and no guaranteed end dot. To understand the full weight of that day, it is necessary to go back further, not just months, but years, to the beginning, or rather, to the place where the beginning of this particular chapter of their lives had started to quietly write itself, in the small, private moments that the cameras never reached and the press never fully knew. Because the story of William and Catherine is not simply a fairy tale, even though it has often been told as one. It is the story of two real people who fell in love in their early 20s, who built a life together under extraordinary pressure, who raised 3 children while living inside one of the most watched and scrutinized institutions in the world, and who faced, as all people eventually face, A moment that tested everything they thought they knew about their own strength. They had met at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, back when William was simply a prince still learning what kind of man he wanted to be. And Catherine Middleton was a young woman from a close-knit, grounded family who had worked hard to build something real and lasting. There was nothing inevitable about their relationship. There were years of uncertainty, a very public breakup that was dissected endlessly by tabloids, a reconciliation, and finally, in April of 2011, a wedding that an estimated 2 billion people around the world watched with something close to collective joy. They were, to many, the most hopeful thing about the royal family in a generation: young, warm, clearly devoted, and committed to doing the work in a way that felt genuine rather than merely ceremonial. The years that followed were full, demanding, and largely happy. George was born, and then Charlotte, and then Louis. The family became a symbol not just of royal continuity, but of something more accessible: parents who attended school plays, who took their children on ski holidays, who laughed in public and looked genuinely at ease with one another. William took on more responsibilities as Queen Elizabeth's health declined. Catherine developed her patronages, her own distinct causes, her identity as a working royal in her own right. From the outside, they looked like exactly what so many people needed them to be: steady, devoted, and unbreakable. But steadiness is not the same thing as ease. And devotion does not protect anyone from the particular kind of pain that comes from forces entirely beyond one's control. In the months leading up to that day, the day of the royal visit, the day of the welcome that would end in tears, something had been building. Something private and enormous. Something that, when it finally became impossible to keep entirely contained, would rewrite the public understanding of who William and Catherine were, and what they had been quietly carrying all along. The visit had been scheduled as a show of solidarity, a show of presence. In the tradition of the British monarchy, there are moments when simply showing up is itself the statement. When the act of being seen, of continuing, is more powerful than any words that could be spoken. The organizers had hoped that this would be one of those moments, that the appearance of the Prince and Princess of Wales, composed and together, would send a message of continuity, of resilience, of the quiet English virtue of carrying on. And in the early minutes of that appearance, it seemed like that was exactly what was happening. But the human heart is not a press office. And the human face, no matter how trained to composure, tells truths that the mind sometimes cannot suppress. Those truths began to show themselves gradually, in the slight pauses, before certain smiles reached full bloom. In the way Catherine's eyes occasionally went somewhere else, even as her body remained perfectly present. In the way William's jaw tightened imperceptibly when someone in the crowd called out something kind, something well-meaning, something that under other circumstances would have been easy to receive, but on this day landed somewhere tender and unprotected. Something was wrong. And the crowd, as crowds often do, began to feel it. It was an older woman near the front of the rope line who first broke the careful surface of the day. She had brought flowers, yellow and white, wrapped in brown paper the way her mother had taught her. She held them out to Catherine with both hands, the way you offer something precious, and as Catherine took them, the woman leaned in and said something quietly, words that no microphone caught, words that belonged only to that moment between two strangers. And Catherine's face, so carefully held until that point, shifted. The eyes filled. She pressed her lips together in that particular way that anyone who has ever tried not to cry in public will immediately recognize. She managed a soft thank you and moved on. But she carried those unshed tears with her for the rest of the morning. And everyone who had been watching closely enough had seen them, after the appearance. After the cars had pulled away, and the crowds had begun to disperse, and the flowers had been collected, and the organizers had begun their debriefs. Reporters who had been there began talking among themselves. They compared notes. They reviewed footage. They asked the question that was already forming in the minds of the millions who had watched at home. What exactly was happening with William and Kate? What was the weight that had been so visible and so carefully borne? In the days that followed the appearance, the newspapers were filled with the kind of breathless, speculative language that royal watchers had come to know very well. Photographs from the visit were analyzed with the thoroughness of crime scene investigators. Body language experts were called in. Former palace aides gave carefully worded comments. Social media filled with screenshots, a particular angle, a certain moment, a split second of unguarded expression, and people added their own interpretations. their own fears, their own projections onto what they had seen. The royal family, as an institution, said very little. That, in itself, was read as a statement. Catherine had always been skilled at managing the gap between what she felt and what she showed. This was not coldness. Anyone who had ever been on the receiving end of her attention in person would say the opposite. That she was warm in a way that surprised people. That she had a genuine gift for making whoever was in front of her feel like they were the only person in the room. But she had grown up understanding, in a way that became even more pointed after she married into the royal family, that public emotion is a complicated thing. Tears shown too easily are called fragility. Composure held too tightly is called coldness. The line between the two is narrow and constantly moving. And navigating it requires a kind of discipline that most people will never be asked to develop on the day of the visit. She had been asked to navigate that line while carrying something she had not yet fully shared with the world. Something that had entered her life without warning and changed everything. The shape of her days, the texture of her sleep, the quiet conversations she and William had behind closed doors at night when the children were in bed and the duties of the day had finally, briefly, been set aside. She had been carrying it with grace, which is to say she had been carrying it at enormous personal cost. In the way that grace almost always demands, to understand what was happening inside Kensington Palace during those months. It helps to understand the particular kind of pressure that the royal family exists within. Not the ceremonial pressure. The kind that comes with learning to walk correctly, and speak correctly, and stand correctly, but the deeper, less visible pressure that has to do with being, at all times, something larger than yourself. William had grown up entirely inside that pressure. He had never known a version of life that was not shaped by it. His childhood had been formed by it in ways both subtle and devastating. And it had left marks on him that he spent much of his adult life trying to understand and manage. His mother, Diana, had understood that pressure in a way that was both profound and ultimately destructive. She had tried to reshape it, to use it differently, to turn the spotlight of public attention toward things that mattered rather than simply toward the performance of royalty. And she had paid an enormous price. Her death, when William was 15, had left a wound that never fully closed, not because wounds of that kind are capable of fully closing, but because William had never been afforded the ordinary privacy in which grieving is done. His grief had been public property from the moment it began. The cameras had followed him to his mother's funeral. The world had watched him walk behind her coffin with the particular, terrible composure of a boy who had been told, in word and in silent expectation alike, that a future king does not fall apart. He had carried that lesson into his adulthood. He had tried, as an adult and a husband and a father, to create a different kind of life, one in which the people he loved most were given the protection his mother had been denied. He had spoken, publicly and with real vulnerability, about the importance of mental health, about the cost of keeping things hidden, about the particular damage that comes from performing strength while quietly disintegrating inside. He had tried to build a royal identity that included honesty, that acknowledged human limitation, that made room for the kind of openness that his position had traditionally worked against. But good intentions and genuine effort are not always enough. Not when the thing you are facing is something that no amount of intention or effort can simply resolve. The weeks before the visit had been harder than the public knew. Inside the household, the tension that comes from sustained uncertainty had been building in all the invisible ways that tension builds, in shorter conversations and longer silences. In the particular kind of tiredness that is not physical, but something deeper. In the moments when one or both of them would simply stop what they were doing and stand very still, as if the ordinary tasks of a day had briefly become incomprehensible. The children had been managed carefully, given the stability and routine that children need, insulated as much as possible from the particular atmosphere that settles into a house when the adults inside it are quietly afraid. George, at 12, was old enough to sense that something was different without yet being old enough to fully understand what it was. He was a careful, observant child. People who interacted with him regularly remarked on his quiet attentiveness, the way he took things in before responding, the way he seemed to hold more information than he let on. Charlotte, at 10, was her mother's daughter in certain ways, emotionally perceptive, socially fluent, able to read a room with an accuracy that adults found alternately charming and slightly unsettling. Louis, the youngest, was still largely operating in the blissful present tense world of small children, where the gravity of things beyond his immediate experience had not yet fully arrived. Catherine had been meticulous in the way she managed information and emotion around them. She was that kind of mother, the kind who thought very carefully about what children should carry and what should be kept from them. Who understood that children take their cues from the emotional environment more than from the words adults speak. Who worried at length about what her own fear might be passing, silently and involuntarily, to the three small people she loved more than anything else in her life. William had worried about this too. They had talked about it, quietly and at length, in the way that parents who are also partners do, circling the same ground from different angles, trying to find the approach that would cause the least harm. The decision to go ahead with the visit, with the appearance, had not been made lightly. There had been conversation about it, consideration of whether it was the right moment, whether they were ready, whether showing up would help, or whether staying away might send its own necessary message. In the end, the decision had been made in the way that so many of their decisions were made, balancing the private cost against the public expectation, weighing what they owed to themselves against what they felt they owed to their roles, trying to land somewhere that honored both without entirely sacrificing either. On the morning of the visit, before the cars arrived, before the cameras and the crowds and the flowers and the flags, there had been a moment between them in one of the rooms of Kensington Palace, a quiet room. Not grand, the kind of room that is just a room when you strip away everything else. They had stood there together, and William had taken Catherine's hand. And she had looked at him for a long moment with that particular look that belongs only to two people who have spent enough time together to know each other's silences as well as their words. And then they had both taken a breath and squared their shoulders and gone out to do what they had agreed to do. The crowd outside did not know about that moment in the quiet room. They did not know about the weeks of careful, exhausted navigation that had preceded it. They did not know about the conversations with doctors, with advisors, with the very small circle of people they truly trusted. They knew only what they saw: a prince and a princess walking toward them through the autumn air, smiling and waving and shaking hands and accepting flowers. And most of them saw exactly what they had come to see: reassurance, presence, continuity, the familiar and beloved faces of a couple they had followed for years. But some of them saw more. Some of them, perhaps because they had their own experience of standing in a public place while privately carrying something enormous. Perhaps because grief or fear or worrying has a particular frequency that the human heart is tuned to recognize, saw the truth of what was happening beneath the surface. And those were the ones who pressed forward to the rope line with their flowers and their quiet words, who leaned in and said the things that undid, for just a moment, all the careful composure. Who gave Catherine and William the only thing that was actually needed on a day like that day: the acknowledgement that what they were going through was real and hard. And seen. The woman with the yellow and white flowers had been one of those people. She had lost someone herself, not long ago. People who knew her said she had been through a difficult year, that she understood in her bones what it meant to smile in public while your private world was reshaping itself around something irreversible. She had come that morning not just to see the prince and princess, but with the specific intention of saying something that went beyond the ceremonial. She had rehearsed it quietly at home. She had held her flowers and thought about the right words and decided, finally, that sometimes the right words are simply the honest ones. When Catherine's diagnosis was finally shared with the world, it did not arrive with the blunt shock of a sudden announcement. It arrived, instead, the way the truth often arrives when it has been carefully held for a long time, slowly, and then all at once, and with the particular weight of something that had been true before anyone said it out loud. The word cancer had been part of private conversations for weeks before it became part of the public record. And when it became public, the response was something that surprised even those who had expected a significant reaction. The country, and then the world, went very quiet. And then it went somewhere else entirely, towards something that looked a great deal like grief. People grieved in the way that they grieve for figures who are not personally known to them but have, nonetheless, become part of the architecture of their lives, the people who show up at the edges of every major chapter, whose faces are familiar in the way that a beloved street corner is familiar, whose absence you do not know to anticipate until the moment it becomes possible, and suddenly you cannot stop thinking about it. Catherine had become that for millions of people, not just in Britain, though the grief was most concentrated there, but across the world, in countries where the British royal family was followed with intense interest, in places where her work on early childhood development and mental health had made an impression. In households where young mothers had pointed to her and said, quietly, "There is someone who seems to be genuinely trying," the diagnosis, as it was eventually explained, had been discovered during a period of abdominal surgery in January. The surgery itself had been planned, not entirely routine, but also not the kind of emergency that announces itself with sirens. Catherine had gone in for what had been publicly described as planned abdominal surgery, with the expectation that she would return to royal duties after a period of recovery. That expectation had been reasonable at the time. It became unreasonable very quickly, because what the surgeons found in the course of that procedure was not what they had gone in looking for. And the road from that discovery to the eventual, careful, considered announcement had been one of the most painful stretches of time that William and Catherine had ever navigated together. There is a particular kind of time that people describe when they are processing a serious medical diagnosis, a strange, suspended quality to the days, as if ordinary time has been replaced by something thicker and slower and harder to move through. The mornings arrive but do not feel like mornings. Meals happen but are not tasted. Children are held a little longer than usual. Conversations that once seemed pressing reveal themselves to be trivial. The things that matter clarify themselves with a sharpness that is both unbearable and, in its way, a gift. People who have been through it describe it as the most isolating experience of their lives, even when they are surrounded by support. Because the knowledge itself is so personal, so interior, so fundamentally impossible to fully share. Catherine had been 42 years old when the diagnosis arrived. In the context of everything she had been, everything she had built, everything she was still in the middle of becoming, 42 felt impossibly early for this particular conversation to be forced upon her. She was still deep in the work she cared most about. She was still raising 3 children who needed her in the particular, irreplaceable way that children need their mother. She was still at the point in a royal career where the foundations had been laid and the real, meaningful work was finally beginning to find its shape. And here, without warning or permission, was this thing that had entered her life and demanded to become its primary fact. William learned the news in the way that spouses learn it, sitting beside someone they love in a room that smells of antiseptic and quiet competence, listening to words that a careful, compassionate doctor has chosen with great deliberation, and feeling the floor of ordinary life shift beneath him in a way that it had shifted only once before in his life. The comparison was not one he could have avoided making. His mother had also received a diagnosis. His mother had also faced the gap between a public self and a private truth. His mother had been told things in medical rooms that the world outside those rooms did not yet know. The parallel was too close and too painful to ignore. And he sat with it in the days that followed, examined it, measured it, tried to understand what it meant and what it did not mean, and ultimately set it aside as best he could in order to be what Catherine needed him to be: present, steady, and not paralyzed by his own fear. He was not always successful. There were evenings, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, when the steadiness cracked. When he sat in some corner of Kensington Palace and let himself feel, fully and without performance, what he was carrying. The fear, the helplessness, the particular anguish of loving someone very much and being unable to take the thing away from them. The anger, too, that he would not have described to many people, but that was real, a low, persistent fury at the randomness of it, at the fact that this was happening to this person, that this was the particular hardship that had found its way to his family's door. He had done grief in public once before. He was doing it again, now, in private. And the private version, he was discovering, was in some ways harder. The decision about when and how to tell the children had occupied many of their conversations during those early weeks. It was perhaps the most painful logistical decision they faced, because there is no clean way to have that conversation. No age-appropriate script that makes it easier. No way to give your children the information they need without also giving them the fear that comes with it. They had consulted professionals. They had talked to people who had been through similar experiences. They had read, thought, argued gently, and then come back together to think some more. In the end, they had told the children the truth, a version of it shaped for each child's age and capacity. But the truth nonetheless, because they had both agreed, independently and then together, that secrets do more damage than honesty. That children's imaginations fill silence with things far worse than reality. and that their children deserved to know. George had listened with the stillness that was becoming one of his defining characteristics. He had asked questions, careful and specific, and then had sat quietly for a long time. Charlotte had cried immediately and openly, the way her mother sometimes cried, without apology or performance, just letting it be what it was, and then had straightened up and asked what she could do to help. Louis had not fully understood, in the way that 7-year-olds often do not fully understand the things that lie beyond their current world. But he had felt the atmosphere of the conversation and had climbed into his mother's lap and stayed there for a long time without being asked. It was Louis, actually, who had given Catherine one of the things she returned to most often in the weeks that followed, a moment of pure, uncomplicated love that had no agenda and no complication. That was simply the gift of a small person's complete and trusting presence. She thought about it in hospital waiting rooms. She thought about it on the days when the treatment made her feel like a stranger in her own body. She thought about it when the fear came in the night, and she lay awake in the dark trying to find her way back to something solid. That small warm weight on her lap. The way he had put his hand on her arm without looking up from whatever small world he had been inside. The ordinary, miraculous fact of him. The preparation for the public announcement had taken time. There were conversations with palace communications advisors, with the king, with the small circle of people who had been brought into the knowledge. There were drafts of statements and revisions, and careful consideration of every word, because when you are a person of this particular kind of public significance, the way you say something is almost as important as what you say, and the wrong word can be its own kind of harm. Catherine had been involved in those conversations in a way that some of her advisors had found surprising, given what she was dealing with. She had opinions about the wording. She had things she wanted to communicate and things she did not want communicated. She had, throughout the process, remained fundamentally herself, thoughtful, precise, caring about the effect of her words on people she would never meet, what she had wanted most. She said in those conversations was for the announcement not to frighten people, not to feel like a summons to grief or a rehearsal for something worse. She was in treatment. The treatment was what had been recommended. She was following medical advice, and she was surrounded by the best possible care and the people she loved most. She was going to be honest, but she was also going to be calm. Because she felt, and this was important to her, personally important in a way that went beyond public relations, that calm was the truth of where she was. That she had moved through the worst of the shock and arrived somewhere more settled, more resolved, more oriented toward the present and the practical rather than toward the terror of the unknown.